Welcome to this new lecture about buoyant forces and Archimedes' principle. A fundamental principle affecting objects submerged in fluids was discovered by Greek mathematician and natural philosopher Archimedes. Archimedes' principle can be stated as follows. Any object completely or partially submerged in a fluid is buoyed up by a force with magnitude equal to the weight of the fluid displaced by the object. Many historians attribute the concept of buoyancy to Archimedes' bathtub epiphany, when he noticed an apparent change in his weight upon lowering himself into a tube of water. As we're going to look, buoyancy is also a method of determining density. Everyone has experienced Archimedes' principle. It is relatively easy, for example, to lift someone if you are both standing in a swimming pool, whereas lifting the same individual on a dry land may be a difficult task. Water provides partial support to any object placed in it. We often say that an object placed in a fluid is buoyed up by the fluid, so we call this upward force the buoyant force. So, the buoyant force is not a mysterious new force that arises in fluids. In fact, the physical causes of the buoyant force is the pressure difference between the upper and lower sides of the object, which can be shown to be equal to the weight of the displaced fluid. In a picture that you are not looking, but I'm going to describe, the fluid inside the indicated sphere, colored darker blue, is present on all sides by surrounding fluid. Arrows indicate the forces arising from the pressure. Because pressure increases with depth, the arrows on the underside are larger than those on top. Adding them all up, the horizontal component cancel, but there is a net force upward. This force to the difference in pressure is the buoyant force that we represent with the letter B in capital letters. The sphere of water neither rises nor falls, so the vector sums of the buoyant force and the force of gravity on the sphere of fluid must be zero. And it follows that B equals to m times g, where m is the mass on the fluid and g is the gravity. Replacing the shaded fluid with a cannonball of the same volume change only the mass on which the pressure acts, so the buoyant force is the same. B equals to m times g, where again m is the mass of the displaced fluid, not the mass of the cannonball. Be careful with that. The force of gravity on the heavier ball is greater than it was on the fluid, so the cannonball sinks.
Archimedes' principle can also be obtained from the equation that states that the pressure sub 2 times the area minus the pressure sub 1 times the area minus the mass times the gravity equals to 0. Okay?
That the difference of pressures times the area of each one minus the mass times the gravity equals to 0. So relating pressure and depth using a figure, we can look like horizontal forces from the pressure cancels, but in the vertical direction, P sub 2a acts upward on the bottom of the block of fluid, and P sub 1a and the gravity force on the fluid. Mg acts downward, giving the next equation. The buoyant force equals to the second pressure times the area minus the pressure 1 times the area equals to the mass times the gravity, where the buoyant force has been identified as a difference in pressure equal in magnitude to the weight of the displaced fluid. This buoyancy force remains the same regardless of the material occupying the volume in question because it's to the surrounding fluid. Using the definition of density, the last equation we talk about converts into the next one. The buoyant force B equals to the density of the fluid times the volume of the fluid times the gravity. Okay, where P of fluid is the density of the fluid and B sub fluid is the volume of the displaced fluid. This result applies equally to all shapes because any irregular shape can be approximated by a large number of infinitesimal cubes. It is instructive to compare the forces on a totally submerged object with those on a floating object, or partially submerged. So let's study the case number 1. A totally submerged object. When an object is totally submerged in a fluid of density rho, the upward buoyant force acting on the object has a magnitude of B equals to the density times the volume times the gravity. Okay? If the object has a density rho of the object, the downward gravitational force acting on the object has a magnitude equals to the weight equals to mass times gravity equals to the density of the object times the volume of the object times the gravity. And the net force, and it is the buoyant force minus the weight. So it's the difference between densities times the volume of the object times the gravity. Therefore, if the density of an object is less than the density of the fluid, the net force exerted on the object is positive, upward, and the object accelerates upward. As in an active figure that you're now looking, if the density of the object is greater than the density of the fluid, then the net force is negative and the object accelerates downward. This was the case number one, a totally submerged object. Now let's move into the case number two, a floating object. So now consider a partially submerged object in a static equilibrium floating in a fluid. In this case, the upward buoyant force is balanced by the downward forces of gravity acting on the object. If the fluid volume is displaced by an object, which corresponds to the volume of the part of the object beneath the fluid level, then the magnitude of the buoyant force is given by B equals to the density of the fluid by the volume of the fluid times the gravity. Because the weight of the object is weight equals to mass times gravity, and this must be equal to the density of the object times the volume of the object times the gravity, we can use that. Obviously, if there need to be imbalance, the weight must be equal to the upward buoyant force. So it follows that the density of the fluid times the volume of the fluids times the gravity must be equal to the density of the object times the volume of the object times gravity. Or if we just want to actually reduce this, we're going to get the same quotients. The quotient between the densities is equal to the quotient of the volumes. So the equation that I just mentioned neglects the buoyant force of the air, which is slight because the density of air is only 1.29 kilograms per cubic meter at sea level. Okay. Under normal circumstances, the average density of a fish is slightly greater than the density of water, so a fish would sink if it didn't have a mechanism for adjusting its density. By changing the size of the internal swim bladder, fish maintain neutral buoyancy as they swim to various depths. The human brain is immersed in a fluid of density. It's about 1,007 kilograms per cubic meter, which is slightly less than the average density of the brain. That is around 1,040 kilograms per cubic meter. Consequently, most of the weight of the brain is supported by the buoyancy force of the surrounding fluid. In some clinical procedures, a portion of this fluid must be removed for diagnostic purposes. During such procedures, the nerves and blood vessels in the brain are placed under great strain, which in turn can cause extreme discomfort and pain. Great care must be exercised with such patients until the initial volume of the brain fluid has been restored by the body. Okay, so these are the two cases, guys. Thank you for your attention.